8 armed operators walked into Maplewood General Hospital at 9:14 on a Tuesday morning, and every conversation in the lobby died on the spot. People pressed against walls. A security guard reached for his radio and then thought better of it. The men moved in 2 columns, tactical gear, no explanation, weapons holstered but visible. And then they stopped, right in front of a woman in blue scrubs holding a patient chart. The lead operator looked at her for one long second. Then he snapped into a perfect military salute. 7 men followed in the same instant. The nurse didn't flinch. She simply stood there, straight-backed, and the chart never trembled in her hands. If this story already has you locked in, follow my channel, hit like, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all started. The shift started at 5:45 in the morning, which meant Dara Whitfield was already in the building by 5:15. She didn't do it to impress anyone. She did it because she knew the night nurses were exhausted, because the supply carts were always half restocked after a heavy overnight, and because 3 minutes of preparation at the start of a shift could be the difference between a controlled situation and a complete disaster 2 hours later. She'd learned that a long time ago, not in nursing school, somewhere else entirely. Maplewood General was a 340-bed hospital on the eastern edge of Caldwell City, the kind of regional medical center that handled everything from routine deliveries to major trauma without enough staff to handle any of it cleanly. The emergency department alone ran 15% over capacity most weeks. The nurses knew it. The charge nurses knew it. Administration pretended the numbers were a staffing blip rather than a structural collapse in slow motion. Dara had been at Maplewood for 4 months. She kept her head down, did her work, and went home. She ate lunch alone at the small table near the supply corridor because the break room had too many conversations she didn't want to get pulled into. She didn't talk about herself. When people asked what she'd done before nursing, she said she'd worked in emergency services, which was technically accurate, and she left it at that. The 10-year gap on her resume had almost cost her the job. During her interview, the hiring coordinator, a tired woman named Patrice, who'd clearly been through this conversation before, had looked at the paperwork and said carefully, "There's a significant gap here between your Army discharge and your nursing licensure." "Yes," Dara said. Patrice waited. "I can't speak to what I did during that period," Dara said. "I can tell you my clinical skills are current, my licensure is clean, and I will not be a liability in your ED." Patrice had studied her for a long moment. Then she'd stamped the paperwork. That was 4 months ago. Since then, Dara had built a quiet reputation. Not the kind that got you talked about, but the kind that got you trusted. The kind where a charge nurse with a bad situation would scan the floor and feel slightly better when she spotted Dara already moving toward the right room. Dr. Marcus Holt noticed none of this. Holt was the head of emergency medicine at Maplewood General, and he carried that fact with him every moment he was in the building, which was most moments of most days. He was good at his job in the technical sense. His diagnostic instincts were sharp, his hands were steady, his judgment in a controlled trauma situation was reliable. But he had built his entire professional identity on a very specific kind of intelligence, the kind that required everyone around him to be slightly less capable than he was. When the hierarchy held, Holt was functional. When it was disrupted, he became dangerous. He'd noticed Dara the way you notice a piece of furniture that's been moved. She was quiet, which should have been fine, but the quiet wasn't deferential. She didn't hover near the nurse's station waiting for instruction. She moved through the floor with a certainty that irritated him before he could explain why. The first time it happened was during a chest pain workup in week 2. Holt had been reviewing the chart when Dara said, without preamble, "His troponins are trending up. Second draw came back 20 minutes ago." Holt looked at her. "I'm aware of what the labs show, nurse." "Whitfield." "I'm aware, Nurse Whitfield. I don't need the labs narrated to me." "He's also been diaphoretic for the last 15 minutes, she said. "That wasn't in the chart yet." Holt had turned back to the chart. He ordered the echo 15 minutes later. The patient went to the cath lab an hour after that with a 90% LAD occlusion. He never said anything to Dara about it, but he started watching her. By month 3, there had been 3 other moments like it. Not dramatic, not confrontational, just Dara saying the quiet, accurate thing before Holt's own thinking caught up with it. Each one was small, each one accumulated. He started asking other nurses about her. Not directly. Sideways. She seems very confident for someone new, waiting to see who agreed. Some did, some didn't. The ones who worked with Dara regularly tended to change the subject. The morning of the 14th, a Tuesday, the kind of gray November Tuesday that stays cold all day, started like every other shift. Dara was in early, running a supply check on Bay 4, when the day nurses started filtering in. She traded handoffs with a night nurse named Renata, who looked like she hadn't slept in 3 shifts, got the rundown on the current patients, and clocked the condition of every IV line and monitor before the day officially began. Dr. Holt arrived at 7:15 in his usual state, which was controlled impatience. He held a small group case review at 7:30 every Tuesday with the residents. It was technically voluntary. The residents treated it as mandatory. Today, there were 4 of them gathered near the whiteboard in the conference alcove. 3 second-year residents and a new intern named Perry, who still wrote everything down even when there was nothing worth writing. Dara happened to be restocking the crash cart 3 feet away. She wasn't trying to listen. The alcove had no walls. Penetrating abdominal trauma, male, 42, Holt said, pulling up the case. GSW to the right upper quadrant. Talk me through the immediate priorities. The residents talked. They were decent. Not brilliant, but training. Holt pushed them on a hemorrhage control question, and there was a pause. The kind of pause where everyone in a group is doing the calculus of whether they know enough to speak or whether silence is safer. Dara, not looking up from the crash cart, said, "You're not going to get ahead of the bleed with pressure alone if the portal vein's involved. You need to be thinking about damage control resuscitation before he gets to the table." There was a silence. It was not a comfortable one. Holt turned slowly. Dara looked at him. She hadn't raised her voice. She wasn't being combative. She'd simply said the accurate thing. "I'm sorry," Holt said. "Were you invited to participate in this session?" "No." "Then I'd appreciate it if you focused on whatever it is you're doing over there." "I'm restocking the crash cart." "Then do that." The residents didn't look at her. The intern stopped writing. Dara turned back to the cart. Holt finished the case review. But afterwards, standing in the corridor, he said to Dr. Patricia Nguyen, the senior resident he trusted most, "Someone needs to have a conversation with Whitfield about appropriate boundaries." Nguyen, who had watched Dara work for 3 months and held a specific private opinion about the situation, said, "I can pass that along." She didn't. The complaint came on a Wednesday. Dara found out about it from the charge nurse, Tanya, who was the kind of person who believed in giving people information they needed rather than protecting them from it. Holt filed a formal complaint with administration, Tanya said, leaning in the doorway of the supply room. Says you've been overstepping your scope of practice, specifically cites the Tuesday case review thing. Dara finished labeling the supply bin. "Okay, that's all you've got? Okay? What else would I say?" Tanya studied her. "He's got pull here. He's been at Maplewood for 9 years. He sits on the Physician Advisory Committee." "I know." "He's done this before," Tanya said, quieter now. "There was a tech 2 years ago, Rodney. Good at his job. Holt decided he was a problem. Rodney was gone inside of 6 weeks. Dara looked up from the supply bin. "I'm not Rodney," she said. It wasn't a boast. It was a statement of fact. Tanya couldn't quite explain why it landed the way it did. Something in the flatness of it, the complete absence of defensiveness. But she walked away from that conversation unsettled in a way she didn't fully understand. The formal review was scheduled for the following Friday. In the days leading up to it, the hospital's social dynamics shifted in the imperceptible way they do when an institution senses blood. People who had been neutral became cautious. People who had been cautious started distancing. A nurse named Glenda, who had borrowed Dara's pen twice a week for 4 months, suddenly found other pens to borrow. 2 residents stopped making eye contact in the corridor. Dr. Holt, for his part, was visibly satisfied. He moved through the department with a particular ease during those days, the ease of a person who had set something in motion and knew how it ended. He'd written the complaint carefully. He'd documented the Tuesday incident, framed it as a pattern of insubordination, and included a broader statement about the importance of maintaining clear professional hierarchies in emergency medicine settings. What he hadn't documented, couldn't document, was the real reason. 6 weeks earlier, Dara had been in Bay 2 when she saw Holt preparing a medication order for a patient in Bay 3. She had looked at the board. She had looked at the patient's chart flag, and she had quietly walked to Tanya and said, the Dilaudid order in Bay 3 needs to be reviewed. The patient's on a MAO inhibitor. It's in the chart, page 2. Tanya had checked, pulled the order, flagged it. Holt had been told there was a chart error. He was never told who caught it, but Dara had been standing 6 feet away when the pharmacist came to clarify, and she had seen the exact moment Holt's eyes tracked to her. She hadn't flinched. She'd gone back to her patient. He hadn't forgotten. The formal review was in a third-floor conference room, which meant it had a window and a table long enough to make everyone feel like they were at opposite ends of something. Dara sat on one side. Across from her were the director of nursing, a woman named Sylvia Marsh, who had the particular exhaustion of someone who had spent 30 years managing situations that should have been prevented, and an HR representative named David, whose last name Dara hadn't caught and didn't need. Dr. Holt had submitted his complaint in writing and was not present, which Dara had expected. Sylvia went through the documentation. Dara listened. When it was her turn to speak, she was precise. She didn't apologize for knowing what she knew. She explained the Tuesday incident without framing it as a conflict, just as a clinical situation where relevant information existed, and she provided it. David made notes. Sylvia looked at her over the top of the papers. Dr. Holt has indicated this is part of a pattern. He's indicated that, Dara agreed. You'd need to weigh that against my patient outcomes and the clinical record. You have no formal write-ups before this. No. Your patient satisfaction scores are above average. Yes. Sylvia set the papers down. Nurse Whitfield, I have to be honest with you. This is difficult because the complaint comes from a senior physician with a long history here, and the institution, she paused, chose her words, the institution tends to resolve these situations in a particular way. I understand. Do you have anything further you want on record? Dara thought for a moment. Then she said, I came to Maplewood because I wanted to do this work. I'm good at this work. Whatever Dr. Holt believes about appropriate hierarchies, what I know is that at least one patient in this hospital is alive today because someone read a chart carefully enough to catch a dangerous medication interaction. If the institution decides that's a liability rather than an asset, I'd say the institution might want to think carefully about what it's actually optimizing for. The room was quiet. David stopped writing. Sylvia looked at her for a long moment, then gathered her papers. We'll be in touch by end of week. Dara thanked her and walked out. She didn't sleep well that night. Not because she was afraid, or not exactly afraid, more because she had spent a very long time building a life that was quiet and predictable in hers, and she could feel that quietness developing cracks at the edges. She lived in a small apartment 6 blocks from the hospital. 2nd floor, 1 bedroom, a kitchen that got good morning light. She had a plant on the windowsill that she'd managed to keep alive for 3 months, which felt like a minor personal achievement. She cooked simple things. She ran 3 miles every other morning. She read at night. She did not talk about where she'd been. She did not talk about what she'd done. She had not spoken to anyone from her previous life in 11 months. There were reasons for that. She sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea that had gone cold and thought about Rodney, the technician Tanya had mentioned. She thought about the way institutions calcify around their own internal logic, the way they protect the people who fit the shape of the institution and quietly eliminate the ones who don't. She had seen this happen in systems with infinitely more resources and discipline than a regional hospital, and she had watched it grind down people who were objectively better at their jobs than the people doing the grinding. She also knew, with a specific and private certainty, that her situation was different, not because she was special, because something was coming. She'd been told 11 months ago, when she left, that it would be a clean break, that the work was done, that she was free to build whatever life she wanted. And she had believed that, mostly, and had built this one, the plant, the morning runs, the cold tea, the patients she was quietly keeping alive at Maplewood General. But 3 weeks ago, a man had walked past her on the street in Caldwell City and had been wrong in the specific way that meant something. Wrong coat for the weather, right posture, deliberate non-eye contact in a crowd where you'd naturally scan. She'd noted it and kept walking and said nothing to no one. And then last week, she'd come home to find her apartment exactly as she'd left it, which, if you didn't know what to look for, was convincing. She knew what to look for. She'd had visitors, not hostile ones. She could tell the difference, but the kind that precedes something. She picked up the cold tea, set it down again. Whatever was coming, it was going to arrive on its own schedule. She couldn't hurry it, couldn't stop it. What she could control was how she showed up to work tomorrow. She washed the mug, went to bed, set her alarm for 5. Thursday brought a 12-hour shift and 3 things that shouldn't have happened on the same day. The first was a note in her personnel file. Not official termination, but what amounted to a formal warning and a recommendation that her clinical scope be reassessed, which was HR language for "we're building a paper trail to let you go." Tanya told her with the specific neutral expression of someone delivering bad news they have no power over. Marsh signed it, Tanya said. I don't think she wanted to, but she did. The second was a patient, a 61-year-old man named Vernon, who'd come in with what his wife described as bad indigestion for the past 2 days, and who was gray in a way that bad indigestion doesn't produce. Dara had been the one to get him triaged. She'd clocked the pallor, the mild confusion, the blood pressure that was slightly low for someone his size, and she had gone to the attending on duty. Not Holt, an attending named Doctor. Ben Ferris, who was competent and overworked and generally willing to listen, and said, I think Vernon Okafor in triage needs a full cardiac workup now, not when the room opens up. Ferris had looked at her assessment. You think this is cardiac? I think the presentation is atypical, and I don't want to find out I was wrong in an hour. Ferris had moved him up. The echo showed a pericardial effusion that was 20 minutes from becoming a tamponade. They had drained it before it became a crisis. Vernon's wife, a small woman named Cecile, who had been in the waiting room for 2 hours and had clearly not breathed properly the entire time, grabbed Dara's hand in the hallway afterward and said, Is he going to be okay? Yes, Dara said, and it was the truth. The third thing happened at 4:30 in the afternoon. Dara was charting at the nurse's station when Holt came through the department. Not unusual, he was often there in the late afternoon. But this time he stopped, right in front of her workstation, in a way that was not accidental. I understand the review went as expected, he said. Dara didn't look up from the chart. I heard the same thing. For what it's worth, he said, I don't have anything personal against you. I just think clear professional lines exist for a reason. Now she looked up. She studied him for a moment. He looked completely sincere, which was, she thought, the most interesting thing about him. He had genuinely reframed his own motives so thoroughly that he believed this version of events. The man who had filed a retaliation complaint over a medication catch he'd never officially acknowledged had convinced himself he was maintaining professional standards. She said, You're right that professional lines exist for a reason. He nodded, satisfied. The reason, she continued evenly, is to protect patients, not to protect physicians who don't want to be corrected. The satisfaction left his face. She went back to the chart. Holt stood there for 2 more seconds. Then he walked away without another word. Friday morning arrived cold and clear. Dara was halfway through her supply check when Tanya appeared in the doorway with an expression she'd never seen on Tanya's face before. There are people downstairs, Tanya said. What kind of people? 8 of them, military, armed. A pause. They came in through the main entrance and they're asking for you by name. Dara set down the supply list. She didn't speak for a moment. Didn't show anything on her face. Inside, something that had been coiled tight for 11 months shifted. Not with fear, but with the particular quality of recognition you feel when something you've been waiting for, even without knowing you were waiting, finally arrives. How are they asking? She said. Tanya frowned. What do you mean? Are they asking in the way that means they have a problem, or asking in the way that means they're looking for someone specific? Tanya thought about it. They don't look hostile. The one in front asked the front desk for you specifically. Used your full name, Dara Whitfield. He said, please. Dara exhaled slowly. She picked up her patient chart. She smoothed the front of her scrubs. She looked at Tanya. Tell them I'll be right down, she said. She took the elevator instead of the stairs because she needed 90 seconds to think, and the elevator at Maplewood ran slow. On the way down, she thought about Vernon Okafor, who was currently stable in a room upstairs with his wife sitting beside him. She thought about the warning in her personnel file and the review she was supposed to have next week, and the clinical scope reassessment and the paper trail they were building. She thought about the man who had been wrong on the sidewalk 3 weeks ago. The elevator opened onto the lobby. 8 operators in tactical gear stood in a loose formation near the entrance. The lobby had gone absolutely still. A child near the coffee kiosk was staring with frank, open curiosity. The security guard was by the wall, arms loose at his sides, not escalating because something about the men in front of him made it clear that escalating would be pointless. The man at the front was perhaps 50, compact, with close-cropped gray at his temples, and the posture of someone who had been standing correctly for so long, it had stopped requiring effort. He saw Dara the moment the elevator doors opened. He walked toward her. The lobby watched. He stopped 2 feet in front of her. And then, without preamble, without speech, in complete silence, he brought his right hand up in a precise military salute. Behind him, in the same instant, 7 men did exactly the same thing. Dara stood perfectly still. Somewhere behind her, she could hear the soft sound of someone dropping a set of keys and not picking them up. The commander held the salute. Dara held his gaze. She didn't salute back. She wasn't in uniform, hadn't been in uniform for 11 months. And that wasn't how this worked anymore. But she stood straight, and she kept her hands still at her sides, and she gave him the small nod that, in a different context, a very different context, would have meant at ease. The commander lowered his hand. His 7 men followed in the same beat. The lobby still hadn't moved. A woman near the reception desk had her phone halfway out of her pocket, and then seemed to decide that whatever was happening, she shouldn't be the one to document it. The child by the coffee kiosk had stopped being curious and started being uncertain, which was the appropriate response. The commander said quietly, "We need a few minutes, Sergeant." Dara's jaw tightened slightly at the word. Old rank, old designation. She hadn't been called that in 11 months. "I'm not a sergeant anymore," she said. "No," he agreed. "But you're still her." They found a family consultation room on the ground floor, the kind with soft chairs and a box of tissues on the table and frosted glass on the door. It seated 8 people comfortably. With 9 of them in it, the room felt very small. The commander's name was Rourke. She'd known that before he introduced himself. She had worked with Rourke twice, in 2 different theaters, neither of which had official names. He was the kind of man who said exactly what he meant and nothing beyond it, which she had always appreciated. "You look different," he said. "Hospital scrubs do that." "Civilian life agreeing with you?" She thought about Vernon Okafor and the pericardial effusion and the warning in her personnel file. "It's got its own complications." He nodded once. He wasn't here to make small talk, and they both knew it, but Rourke did things the right way, which meant the small talk happened first. "How much do you know?" he said. "I know you came in through the main entrance instead of making a call first, which means you wanted it seen." Rourke looked at her steadily. "Smart. I also know that someone checked my apartment 10 days ago. Clean entry, nothing taken, nothing moved that I could prove had been moved. So whatever this is, it's been building." One of the operators near the door, young, maybe 28, with a jaw like a piece of architecture, glanced at Rourke. Rourke didn't look back. "We're not here about the apartment," Rourke said. "We're here because of what happened in Dillard County 6 weeks ago." Dara was still. "We tracked the cell that was planning the Meridian Station attack," Rourke said. "They were in Caldwell City, Dara. 3 weeks of surveillance. We got them clean. No civilian casualties." He paused. "We got them because of a data thread that you flagged 14 months ago when you were still in unit. Something you noted in a secondary report that nobody acted on at the time." She remembered. A logistics pattern, buried in procurement records. The kind of thing that looked like noise unless you were looking for the specific shape of it. She'd written it up, filed it, heard nothing. "It took 14 months for someone to pull the thread," she said. "Yes." "How many people would have died?" Rourke didn't answer immediately, which was itself an answer. "The station handles about 40,000 passengers on a weekday." The room was quiet. "I'm not in unit anymore," Dara said. "No. But the flag was yours?" The work was yours. And there are 8 people in this room. He glanced briefly at his team, who wanted you to know that before we did what we came to do. Which is what exactly? Rourke reached into a document folder that one of his men had been carrying and placed a single sheet on the table between them. It was a formal citation, the kind that didn't get published in any newspaper, the kind that existed in files with restricted access, and the names redacted in every public version. Dara looked at it without picking it up. "You want to go out there," she said. It wasn't a question. "We want it on record," Rourke said. "Official. Witnessed." She understood what he was doing. Whatever was happening in her personnel file upstairs, the formal warning, the scope reassessment, the paper trail Holt had been building, Rourke had walked in the main entrance and saluted her in front of a lobby full of witnesses for a reason. Not because military men were typically theatrical, because someone had decided that what was happening to Dara Whitfield at Maplewood General Hospital needed a specific kind of counterweight. She looked at him for a long moment. "How much do you know about my situation here?" she said. "Enough." She almost smiled. "That's very you, Rourke. We do our research." She looked at the citation again. She thought about what it meant. Not the document, not the recognition, but the fact that these 8 men had walked through that door and saluted her in front of the morning shift at a regional hospital in Caldwell City. The fact that the lobby full of staff and patients, and that one kid at the coffee kiosk had all seen it. "All right," she said. Meant. They went back out through the main corridor, and by then, word had moved through the hospital, the way word moves in hospitals. Fast, distorted at the edges, accurate at the center. There were more people in the lobby now than there had been 20 minutes ago. Not crowding in exactly, but not leaving either. Standing near things, checking their phones, lingering. Tanya was by the reception desk with her arms folded and an expression that Dara could not fully read. Dr. Holt was there too. He'd come down from the 2nd floor, which meant someone had told him, which meant he'd wanted to see it. He stood near the far wall with 2 other senior physicians, and his face was arranged in the neutral professional expression he used when he was doing rapid calculations he didn't want visible. Rourke stopped in the center of the lobby. He didn't use a microphone. Rourke's voice had a natural carry to it, not loud, just precise in a way that reached every corner of the room. "My name is Commander Douglas Rourke. I serve with a federal joint operations unit that I'm not at liberty to name. Approximately 6 weeks ago, a domestic terrorism threat targeting a major transit hub in this state was neutralized. No civilians were harmed. The operation succeeded because of intelligence work that was conducted more than a year ago by a member of our unit." The lobby was absolutely still. "That individual is currently employed as a nurse in this hospital. Her name is Dara Whitfield. She left our unit to pursue this career, and based on everything I've seen in the last 30 minutes, this hospital is better for having her." He turned to Dara. "On behalf of the unit, and with authorization from the Department of Defense, I want to make formally public what she was told would remain classified indefinitely." He reached into the folder a second time. "Dara Whitfield is the recipient of the Federal Distinguished Service Commendation for her intelligence work, which prevented an attack that our analysts estimate would have resulted in between 400 and 700 civilian casualties." Someone in the lobby made a sound, a short, involuntary sound, then quiet again. Rourke looked at her. She could see in his face the particular thing she'd always valued about him. Not warmth exactly, but rigor. The specific respect of one professional for another. "You never asked for recognition," he said. "You didn't ask for it then, and you weren't asking for it now. But some things need to be said out loud." He saluted her again. His 7 men saluted again. Dara stood with her patient chart still in her left hand and didn't flinch and didn't look away. The next 4 hours were unlike anything Maplewood General had experienced in at least the time since Tanya could remember, and Tanya had been there for 11 years. Rourke and his team left within 40 minutes of the lobby statement. They didn't linger, didn't take photographs, didn't accept the coffee that someone from administration frantically offered. They walked out the same way they'd come in. 2 columns, deliberate pace, and then they were gone. What they left behind was considerably more complicated. Sylvia Marsh appeared in the lobby at 10:45 with the expression of someone who had received news she needed to respond to correctly and had approximately 12 seconds to figure out what correctly meant. She found Dara near Bay 6, where Dara had returned to work because the patients in Bay 6 still had needs that predated everything that had just happened in the lobby. "Nurse Whitfield," Sylvia said. "Dr. Marsh." Dara was updating a medication log. "I think we should talk." "I'll be done here in about 10 minutes. Sylvia stood there, which was not something Sylvia Marsh typically did. Stood, waiting. She ran meetings, she made calls. She didn't stand in doorways of emergency bays waiting for nurses to finish medication logs. She stood there for 11 minutes. When Dara came out, she said, "The review on Friday is postponed." Postponed or canceled. A pause. "Pending further administrative review." What does that mean? "It means," Sylvia said carefully, "that certain elements of Dr. Holt's complaint are being re-examined in light of new context. The formal warning that was put in my file yesterday is being reviewed." Dara looked at her, not unkindly, but steadily. "Dr. Marsh, with respect, I've been doing this work correctly for 4 months. The file should have been clean from day one. What changed wasn't my performance." Sylvia held her gaze. "I know that." It was the first honest thing Dara had heard from administration since she'd arrived at Maplewood, and she let it sit for a moment. "What's happening with the complaint?" Dara said. "I can't speak to Dr. Holt's specific situation at this time. But you can say the warning is being reviewed." "Yes." "All right," Dara said. "Then I'll be in Bay 6 if anyone needs me." What Dara did not see, because she was in Bay 6, was what happened in the second-floor administrative corridor at 11:15. Dr. Holt had spent the 45 minutes since Rourke's lobby statement doing something specific and recognizable to anyone who had watched him work. He was restructuring the narrative. He could be seen moving between offices, speaking to 2 senior physicians, laying groundwork. The version of events he was constructing went roughly like this: that the situation with Nurse Whitfield had been a routine HR matter, that the military's arrival was a coincidence of timing, that his concerns about professional boundaries remained legitimate regardless of her background, and that, if anything, her classified history raised additional questions about what she was doing in a civilian medical setting. It was a coherent argument, mostly. Holt was good at coherent arguments. What broke it was Patricia Nguyen. Dr. Nguyen had been a senior resident at Maplewood for 2 years. She was rigorous, careful, and had spent those 2 years learning which situations required her to keep her head down and which ones required her not to. She had been keeping her head down about Dara Whitfield for 4 months, and she had known it was cowardice, and the specific weight of that knowledge had been getting heavier. She went to Sylvia Marsh at 11:30. She brought documentation, 6 months' worth of case notes in which Dara's early interventions had been logged. 3 specific incidents where Nguyen had personally witnessed Dara identify something critical before the attending caught it. And 1 incident, the medication interaction in Bay 3, the Dilaudid, and the MAO inhibitor, documented with timestamps that showed exactly what had happened, who had flagged it, and when. She laid it on Sylvia's desk. "Dr. Holt knew it was Whitfield who caught that order," Nguyen said. "I know he knew. I was standing there." Sylvia looked at the documents. "And the complaint he filed," Nguyen continued. "The Tuesday case review incident. I was there too. She said 1 accurate clinical statement about hemorrhage control. He filed a formal complaint about scope of practice." "You're willing to put this on record?" "That's why I'm here." Sylvia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "This is going to be complicated." "Yes," Nguyen said, "but I should have done it 3 weeks ago." Note. By the afternoon shift change at 3 o'clock, Maplewood General had developed the particular atmosphere of a place where something seismic has happened and the aftershocks are still rolling in. Staff moved with a kind of heightened awareness. Conversations stopped when certain people entered rooms, and the nurses' station had the charged quality of a room that had been talked in heavily for several hours. Dara noticed all of it and said nothing about any of it. She had 2 patients to discharge, 1 to prep for a procedure, and a third, a woman in her mid-40s named Rosalind, who had come in with what she'd described as just a migraine, I get them, and who Dara had been watching for the past 90 minutes with a specific quiet concern. Rosalind was propped against the pillow, pale, with 1 arm across her eyes. Her husband, a large man named Garrett, who was clearly terrified and hiding it behind excessive practical questions, sat in the chair beside her. "The light really bothers her," Garrett said when Dara came in. "More than usual." Since when? Since this morning. He lowered his voice slightly. She gets migraines, I know that, we all know that. But this morning, when she tried to get out of bed, she couldn't. He stopped. She couldn't find the right words. For like a minute, it came back, but... Does she know you're telling me this? Dara said. Garrett glanced at his wife. Roz, the nurse is asking if I can tell her about the word thing. Rosalind lowered her arm. She looked at Dara. It was just a moment. How long has the headache been present? Since last night, but I've had worse. On a scale 7, maybe 8. A pause. I hate that scale. Dara made a note. She asked 4 more questions, each one careful and specific. Then she said quietly, I'm going to order an MRI. I know you're thinking it's just a migraine. It probably is, Rosalind said. Probably, Dara agreed. She didn't say the rest. She went to find the attending. The attending was Dr. Ferris, who had authorized the stat workup on Vernon Okafor 2 days earlier, and who had since developed a very specific policy regarding Dara Whitfield's clinical instincts, which was to listen to them. She explained Rosalind's presentation, the aphasia, even brief, even resolved, the nature of the headache, the photosensitivity pattern. Thunderclap? Ferris said. She described it as a 9 at onset, then settling. She's minimizing. The husband is not. Ferris ordered the CT first, then the MRI. He moved fast. They had the results within an hour. There was blood. Not a lot. A subarachnoid hemorrhage, small but present, the kind that could sit quietly for another few hours and then do something catastrophic, or could be caught and managed before it reached that point. The neurosurgery team was paged. Rosalind was moved to a higher level of care. Garrett, who had been trying very hard to be calm and practical for most of the afternoon, sat down in the hallway outside the imaging suite and put his face in his hands. Dara sat next to him for 3 minutes. She didn't say she was sorry or that everything would be okay or any of the other things that were technically true but didn't help. She said, They caught it. That's the thing that matters right now. They caught it. Garrett nodded without taking his face out of his hands. She gave him another minute, then went back to her patients. At 4:15, Holt found her. She was at the nurse's station, and he came through the department with the particular quality of someone who had decided on a course of action and was committed to it. His face was composed. He'd had several hours to compose it. Whitfield, he said. Not Nurse Whitfield. Just her last name. The way you address someone you'd already decided was beneath formality. She turned from the workstation. I want you to understand, he said, evenly, that this morning doesn't change anything I said in that complaint. A background, whatever kind of background you have, doesn't make it appropriate for a floor nurse to override physician judgment in a clinical setting. Dara looked at him. That's your position, she said. That's my position. Dr. Holt. She kept her voice completely level. Do you know why I flagged the dilaudid order in Bay 3 6 weeks ago? Something moved across his face. Quick. Gone. I flagged it because the patient was going to get hurt, she said. Not because I wanted to be right. Not because I was making a point about hierarchies. Because a man was going to receive a dangerous medication interaction, and I was the person who saw it first and I acted. She paused. If that's what you filed a complaint about, then yes, I'll do it again. You'll do it every time, she said. Without exception. His jaw was tight. The review will proceed, he said. The complaint stands. Then let it, Dara said. She turned back to the workstation. He stood behind her for a moment, that particular stillness of a person waiting for a reaction they're not going to get. And then he left. Tanya, who had been 3 feet away pretending to organize a medication sheet, waited until he was out of the department and said, without looking up, I want you to know I just witnessed that entire conversation. I know. I'm writing it up. Okay. A pause. He's going to escalate. He's going to try, Dara said. And at 4:47 in the afternoon, before Tanya could respond and before Dara could finish the patient note she was typing, the overhead PA system clicked on. Trauma activation. ETA 8 minutes. Multiple casualties. Highway 9, multiple vehicle incident, civilian injuries, unknown number, critical. All available trauma staff to Bay 1 through 4 immediately. The department moved. It moved the way emergency departments move when they have to, instantly, on instinct, every person snapping into the specific shape of their role. Ferris appeared from somewhere. Two other attendings converged on the trauma bays. Equipment carts rolled. Monitors powered on. Dara was already moving before the PA finished. She pulled gloves on the walk to Bay 1, scanned the prep state of the room, found two things out of position, fixed them in 30 seconds flat. The charge nurse was calling assignments, and Dara was already in the right place before her name came up. 8 minutes later, the first ambulance arrived. The crash on Highway 9 had involved a flatbed truck, 2 sedans, and a minivan. 4 critical, 7 serious, the kind of incoming that made a moderate-sized emergency department strain at every seam simultaneously. The first critical patient was a 30-year-old man with crush injuries to his chest and abdomen, unconscious, BP crashing. He came through the bay doors on a gurney with a paramedic doing compressions, and another calling out numbers that were all wrong. Dara was at the head of the gurney before it stopped moving. The coordinating physician was an attending named Dr. Slade, who had been at Maplewood for 4 years and had the particular quality of a competent doctor in a chaotic situation, focused but slightly behind the immediate velocity of events. He was calling out orders. Some of them were right. The sequencing was off. Dara did not say this. Instead, she moved. She had the airway kit in her hands by the time Slade asked for it. She had the chest decompression supplies positioned before the second read. On the breath, sounds confirmed what she could already hear. She communicated with the team beside her in specific short sentences, the kind that carried information without slowing anything down. "Left side tension," she said. Slade heard it. He acted on it immediately. The needle went in. The patient's BP, which had been 92 over nothing and falling, stabilized at 110 over 60 over the next 90 seconds. Bay 2 was a 16-year-old girl, conscious and terrified, with a femur fracture and facial lacerations and a left pupil that was slightly more dilated than the right. Dara spent 4 minutes with her, not because she had 4 minutes, because she didn't, but because the girl was gripping the side of the gurney with both hands, and her breathing was wrong, in the specific way that precedes shock. "I need you to breathe with me," Dara said. Not gently, directly. "In through your nose. Now." The girl looked at her. "Now," Dara said. The girl breathed. "Good. Keep that. Don't stop." She flagged the pupil to the attending, kept moving. By the time the 4th critical patient came through the doors, the department was at its operational limit. Monitors alarming in 2 bays simultaneously. A supply cart that someone had pushed into the wrong position. A second-year resident named Callum, who had gone slightly pale and was not moving efficiently. The specific freeze of someone who was competent in a controlled environment, hitting the edge of their capacity in an uncontrolled one. Dara got to him between bay checks. She didn't give him a pep talk. She gave him a task. "Bay 3 needs a second large bore IV, right now. You can do that." Callum blinked, nodded, went. It was a small thing. It worked. Dr. Holt arrived in the department at some point during the 3rd hour. He had not been on call, which meant he'd come in specifically. Dara didn't look at him when he entered. She was elbow-deep in a critical situation in Bay 1, communicating with Ferris in the terse half-sentences of 2 people who have found a rhythm. And she had no bandwidth for anything outside the room. She heard him, though. Heard him asking someone what the situation was. Heard the slightly different quality of the floor when he was on it. The way some people moved around him, the way others stiffened. She heard Tanya's voice, sharp and uncharacteristically unsubtle. "We've got it covered." And then she heard nothing more from that direction because Bay 1 needed everything she had. The 4th critical patient, a woman in her late 50s who had been the driver of the minivan, whose name Dara didn't know yet and wouldn't know for another hour. Spent 40 minutes in a state of controlled precariousness that required every person in that room to be completely present. Dara was. Ferris was. Callum, who had returned from Bay 3 steadier than he'd left, was. They held her. At the 90-minute mark, the controlled precariousness became controlled stability. Dara stepped out of Bay 1 for the first time in over an hour. The department was still moving, but at a lower frequency. The worst of it was past. 2 patients had gone up to surgery, 1 to the ICU, and the 4th was stable enough to transfer to a monitored bed upstairs. She stood in the corridor outside Bay 1 and pulled off her gloves. Her hands were steady. They were always steady. That was one of the things she'd had to learn. Not steadiness, she'd had that, but what to do with the steadiness when everything around you was not. She looked up. Dr. Holt was standing at the far end of the corridor. He had been watching. She didn't know for how long. His expression was something she had never seen on his face before. Not admiration, not concession. Something more fractured than either of those. The look of a person confronting a specific truth about themselves that they have been very successfully avoiding. He held her gaze for 2 seconds. Then he turned and walked toward the stairwell. Dara looked after him for a moment. Then she turned back to the department because there were still 4 patients who needed monitoring, Callum needed a debrief, and the supply cart in the wrong position was going to be a problem for the next person who needed it fast. She was halfway through repositioning the cart when Tanya appeared beside her. "Holt left the building," Tanya said. "I know." "He looked—" Tanya paused. "I don't have a word for how he looked." "Doesn't matter," Dara said. "Dara—" Tanya's voice had dropped. Something in it made Dara stop. "What?" "Administration got a call while you were in Bay 1. Tanya was watching her carefully. "From someone at the federal level. I don't know the details. I only know because David from HR was in the hallway and he looked like someone had walked over his desk." She paused. "Marsh called an emergency meeting. Senior staff. Holt's been asked to attend." Dara looked at her. Tanya said, "I don't think it's just about the formal warning anymore." Dara pulled off the second glove. She looked down the corridor toward where Holt had been standing. "When is the meeting?" she said. "Right now," Tanya said. "Marsh is pulling the medication error records, all of them, from the last 18 months. The supply cart was in position." Dara smoothed the front of her scrubs. She looked at the department, her department. She'd started to think of it that way without meaning to. And she thought about Vernon Okafor upstairs with his wife, about Rosalind, who was in neurosurgery, about Callum, who had held his nerve in Bay 3, about the woman from the minivan whose name she still didn't know who was alive. She thought about 11 months of quiet, the plant on her windowsill, 3 miles every other morning. She thought about what Rourke had said. "You're still her." "Then let them meet," Dara said. She picked up her patient chart and went back to work. But before she reached Bay 2, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out. Unknown number, local area code, 2 words in the message field, no signature. It's documented. She stared at the message for 3 seconds. Then she put the phone away and walked into Bay 2, and the look on her face when she entered was exactly the same as it had been when she walked in 2 hours ago. Calm, focused, present. And not one person in that room could have guessed what she'd just read. Bay 2 held a 12-year-old boy named Marcus, who had been in the minivan with Rosalind, not related, just in the wrong place, and who had a fractured radius, 3 cracked ribs, and the specific quality of stillness that children get when they're in more pain than they know how to say. His mother was in the waiting room. She'd been told he was stable, which was true, and that someone would come get her shortly, which kept not happening because the department was still in controlled chaos. Dara checked his vitals, adjusted the positioning of his arm, and said, "Does it feel better when you hold it still or when you put it down?" Marcus looked at her. "When I hold it." "Then keep holding it." She made a note. "Your mom's right outside." "I know." "You want me to get her?" He didn't answer for a second, which was its own answer. The 12-year-old version of yes, but I don't want to look like I need it. "I'll send her in," Dara said, and walked out without making it a thing. She flagged the waiting room volunteer on her way past, gave the mother's name, and kept moving. 4 seconds. No ceremony. She was at the nurse's station pulling the next chart when the text message surfaced in her mind again. It's documented. She'd put it away because she'd had to, because Bay 1 needed everything, because Marcus needed something, because that was how this work went. You put things in a compartment, and you dealt with them when you could, and sometimes you never could, and you put them in a deeper compartment. But now it was there again. Unknown number, local area code, 2 words. She thought about who had it. Not Rourke. Rourke didn't communicate that way, and Rourke's people used secure channels that left no local area code trace. Someone inside the hospital, someone who had access to documentation and wanted her to know it existed before the administration meeting finished. She thought about Nguyen, She thought about the case notes Tanya had mentioned, the 6 months of logged interventions. She thought about whether Nguyen had her number and decided she probably did. The internal staff directory had personal contact numbers for emergency escalation, and Nguyen was meticulous about keeping her contact list complete. She pulled Nguyen's number from the directory and sent a single word. You? 3 minutes later, yes, Marsh has everything. Don't come upstairs. Dara stared at the last 2 words. Don't come upstairs meant the meeting was still in progress, meant something was happening that hadn't concluded, meant Nguyen thought Dara showing up would change the dynamic in a way that wasn't favorable. She put the phone away. She pulled the next chart. A 47-year-old man named Terrence, stable, rule out cardiac, elevated troponins on first draw, waiting on second. She went to see him. Mas. The administration conference room on the 3rd floor had a window that looked out over the hospital's east parking lot, and Sylvia Marsh had been staring at that parking lot for approximately 6 minutes, while the HR representative, David, arranged papers and the 2 senior members of the Physician Advisory Committee, Dr. Harlan Bell and Dr. Anastasia Volk, sat on the opposite side of the table from the man who was supposed to be the subject of a different kind of meeting entirely. Dr. Marcus Holt looked like he'd aged 4 years since the morning. The meeting had started as a formal review of the complaint process, specifically whether the complaint against Nurse Whitfield had been filed in good faith, and whether the subsequent warning in her personnel file was procedurally defensible. That had been the agenda. That had lasted approximately 8 minutes. What happened at minute 9 was that Sylvia had placed on the table a set of pharmacy records that the hospital's compliance office had been quietly reviewing for the past 3 weeks. Not because of anything related to Dara Whitfield, because the compliance review was a routine audit that had been scheduled since the previous quarter. The record showed a pattern, not a dramatic pattern, not the kind that showed up in news stories, the kind that only became visible when you looked at a specific physician's ordering behavior over 18 months and cross-referenced it against the clinical notes and the outcomes in the cases where interventions had been logged by nursing staff or pharmacy without formal incident reports. 11 cases. In 11 cases over 18 months, a medication order or a clinical decision by Dr. Marcus Holt had been flagged by another staff member before it caused harm. In 8 of those 11 cases, the flagging staff member was a nurse. In 3 of those 8, the nurse was Dara Whitfield. In 2 of those 3, the intervention had occurred within a week of Holt subsequently escalating a complaint or concern about the flagging nurse's professional conduct. Harlan Bell, who had been at Maplewood for 22 years and had learned to recognize the shape of things before they were fully assembled, had gone very still when he saw the records. Anastasia Volk had said quietly, "Marcus, I need you to explain the Bay 3 incident." And Holt, who had been constructing and dismantling and reconstructing his version of events for the past 4 hours, had said the wrong thing. Not the dishonest thing, so he was too good for that. The wrong thing, which was more damaging. He had said something technically accurate in a way that made the shape of the other 10 incidents suddenly completely clear. He'd said, "I was informed there was a chart inconsistency." Bell said, "You weren't informed it was Whitfield who caught it?" A pause that lasted exactly long enough. "I became aware of that later," Holt said, "and the complaint against her was filed 3 weeks after the incident, which is the standard review period for a pattern of conduct." Bell set the pharmacy records down. He looked at Volk, then he looked at Marsh. Marsh picked up her pen and started writing. Dara heard about the meeting from Tanya at 6:17, which was 43 minutes into her 3rd hour of post-trauma stabilization work, and approximately the moment when the department had finally moved from crisis mode into the elevated version of its normal dysfunction. Tanya came to find her with a deliberateness that meant she'd been looking. "The meeting's done," Tanya said. Dara was charting Terrence's second troponin result. "And? I don't have the full picture. I have fragments. From David, who doesn't know how loud he is on the phone." "Tanya, they pulled 18 months of pharmacy records. There's a compliance issue." She lowered her voice, which in the nursing station meant leaning 2 inches closer. 11 incidents. Something about a pattern of... She stopped, looked around briefly. "They're not calling it negligence yet. They're calling it a systemic documentation concern, which is what they call it before they call it negligence. Dara stopped typing. And the warning in my file, she said. Being removed. Official correction issued as of 5:45. Marsh signed it herself. A pause. The complaint is under secondary review, which is code for it's functionally dead. Dara looked at the screen. The troponin was elevated. She needed to flag it for Ferris. Where's Holt now? She said. In his office, or was. No one's seen him in about 20 minutes. Dara flagged the troponin, saved the chart, and thought about the 11 incidents. She'd known about 3 of them because she'd been the one to catch them. She had not known about the other 8. She thought about the 8 other nurses. Or maybe it was techs, maybe it was pharmacists. She didn't know the specifics. Who had caught something and done what you did. Logged it, flagged it, moved on, never made it about themselves, absorbed whatever came afterward. She thought about Rodney, the tech Tanya had mentioned weeks ago. Whether Rodney was one of the 8. Is there anything I need to do right now? She said. Tanya blinked. What? Is there a process I need to participate in? A statement? Anything with HR? David said they'd reach out to you tomorrow. Then I'll wait for tomorrow. She stood. Ferris needs to see the troponin on Terrence in 7. Tanya stared at her. You're just going to... I'm going to tell Ferris about the troponin, Dara said. That's what I'm going to do. She found Ferris, told him about the troponin, watched him nod and change course toward Bay 7, and then she went to check on Marcus, the 12-year-old with the fractured radius, because his post-pain management assessment was due, and because his mother had seemed like the kind of person who would have 17 questions and deserved real answers to all of them. She was 2 steps from his bay when her phone buzzed again. She pulled it out. Same unknown number as before. But this time it wasn't 2 words. It was a photograph. She stopped in the middle of the corridor. The photograph was of a document. A single page, slightly angled as if shot hastily on someone's phone. It was a formal letter on Maplewood General letterhead. The date at the top was today's. The subject line read, Voluntary Administrative Leave set pending investigation. The name on the letter was Dr. Marcus Holt. Dara looked at the photograph for a long moment. She looked at the date. She looked at the words voluntary administrative leave and understood that it was not voluntary in any meaningful sense, that it was the institutional version of you step back now before we have to do something more permanent in public. She put the phone away. She went into Marcus's bay. His mother, a woman named Diane, who had indeed arrived with a list of questions visible in the tightness of her face, turned immediately. Is he okay? They said stable, but stable means different things. His vitals are where we want them, Dara said. The fracture is clean, no displacement. The ribs will hurt for several weeks, but they're not causing any lung complications. She sat in the chair across from Diane rather than standing, because standing over someone while delivering information is the medical system's version of speaking loudly to someone who doesn't share your language. It doesn't help. It just signals that you have somewhere else to be. What are you worried about that you haven't asked yet? Diane blinked. The ribs. Is there something they can miss? We did a chest x-ray and an ultrasound. If there was a pneumothorax, we'd have caught it. His lung sounds are clear and have been consistent. I'll check them again before we reassess for discharge. And the arm, orthopedics will review in the morning. For tonight, we're managing pain and watching for swelling. If it gets worse or his fingers feel numb, you tell whoever is on immediately. Marcus, from the bed, said, I threw up before. Dara looked at him. When? Like an hour ago. I didn't want to say. She kept her expression neutral. Nausea or just once? Just once. Right after they moved me from the thing, he gestured vaguely toward the direction of the imaging suite. That can happen after contrast, but I'm going to note it and we'll watch it. She made the note immediately, not as a performance of diligence, but because she'd already started recalculating his overnight monitoring needs. Did you feel dizzy when it happened? A little. Headache? I already had one. On a scale, 4 maybe. She adjusted the monitoring order, flagged it for the overnight nurse, made sure the note was time-stamped and specific, because if something developed overnight, the person coming in cold needed to know exactly what had been observed and when. She stayed with them for another 8 minutes. When she left, Diane touched her arm briefly. the way people do when they want to say something and don't have the words. And Dara gave her a small nod and kept moving. It was Callum who found her at 7:50. Callum, the second-year resident who had frozen in the trauma surge and then unfrozen and held his nerve in Bay 3, came around the corner of the supply corridor with the expression of someone delivering news that he's still processing himself. "Dr. Holt is gone," Callum said. "I know." "You know?" "I had some indication." She kept moving through the supply corridor. "What do you need, Callum?" He fell into step beside her, slightly too fast. "I need to tell you something. Something I saw. About 6 weeks ago." She stopped. She turned and looked at him. Callum was 26, maybe 27, the kind of young that still showed in the way he held tension in his shoulders. He'd been at Maplewood for 8 months. He worked hard and knew it, and sometimes worked hard at making sure people knew he knew it, which was the one thing about him that could be sanded off with time. "In Bay 3, he said. "The MAO inhibitor thing. I was in the corridor. I saw you talk to the charge nurse. And then I saw Holt come out of the pharmacy consult, and I saw his face when he looked at you." He stopped, looked slightly uncomfortable. "I was a second year. I didn't know what to say, or who to say it to, or whether it mattered. And then when the complaint came down, He exhaled. "I didn't say anything." Dara looked at him. "I know," he said. "I know. Did you tell anyone about it today?" "I told Dr. Nguyen this afternoon. She said she already had documentation, but I told her what I saw." Dara was quiet for a moment, not cold, just measuring. "Callum," she said, "why are you telling me this directly?" He met her eyes. "Because I should have. 3 weeks ago I should have. And I know that doesn't change anything that happened, but..." He stopped. "You didn't hesitate in that bay today. Not once. And I keep thinking about that." She studied him. He wasn't performing contrition. He was just saying the exact true thing, which was harder than it looked, and which most people couldn't do at 26. "Go write it up," she said. "Not because you owe me, because the record should be complete." He nodded and left. She turned back to the supply inventory. Her hands were steady. They were always steady. But somewhere underneath the steadiness was a weight she'd been carrying for 4 months. The specific weight of being in a place where you know your own value and are watching the institution systematically refuse to know it. And she could feel it shifting. Not gone, just different. The way a thing changes when it stops being uncertain. She was 20 minutes from the end of her shift when Dr. Ferris found her. He was still in trauma scrubs, still carrying the residual alertness of the surge, and he came to her with a directness that meant he'd been thinking about this for a while and had decided the thinking was done. "The woman from the minivan," he said. "Clara Mwangi. She's in the ICU. Her husband called down. He wanted to know the name of the nurse who was in Bay 1. Dara said nothing. "I told him." Ferris looked at her. "He's going to come by tomorrow. I told him he could." "You didn't need to do that." "No," Ferris said, "but I wanted to, because I need to say something to you first, and I'd rather say it before he shows up and makes it a whole thing." He paused. "In Bay 1 today, the tension call, left side. I was about to go right. She'd known. She hadn't said anything in that moment, had just moved left and made the equipment available in a way that guided the decision without overriding it. A small thing, invisible if you weren't looking. Ferris had been looking. "You didn't correct me publicly," he said. "The patient didn't need a correction. She needed a needle." He stopped. "That's a different way of doing it than I would have expected." "Dr. Holt would have expected me to stay in my lane," she said. "Holt is gone," Ferris said. "And whatever comes next with that situation, what I know is that the woman in the ICU is alive. And I know why she's alive." He looked at her with the specific directness of someone who doesn't say things they don't mean. "I'm glad you're here." Dara looked at him for a moment. "Me too," she said. She meant it about the work. She wasn't sure yet about everything else. That was honest. She was finishing her last chart at 8:15 when the department doors opened and a man walked in who did not belong to any of the categories the evening shift instinctively sorted incoming people into. Not a patient, not family, not a delivery. He was mid-50s, in a gray suit that had been good once, with a press ID clipped to his breast pocket, and the particular quality of someone who had been told to wait outside and had decided waiting outside was for other people. His name badge said Caldwell City Record. He was looking around the department with the practiced casualness of a person recording everything. Tanya intercepted him in 15 steps flat. "Media doesn't have access to the clinical area," she said. I'm just... He looked past her toward the nurses' station, toward Dara. "I received a tip," he said, "about something that happened here this morning, the military presence, and about a physician being placed on administrative leave. Is Nurse Dara Whitfield available?" "No," Tanya said. "I just need a few minutes. The clinical area is not accessible to media. I can give you the number for our communications office." She was already moving him backward, the specific body-blocking technique of a person who has removed people from emergency departments before and will do so again without particular effort or apology. He went, but slowly. And at the door he turned and looked directly at Dara, who had been watching from the nurse's station without any change in expression. She looked back. He held up a card. Tanya intercepted that too. After the doors closed, Tanya dropped the card in the bin beside the desk. "Communications office?" she said, returning. "He'll just go around," Dara said. "Probably." Tanya shrugged. "But not tonight. Tonight." Dara looked at the clock. 8:22. Her shift had officially ended at 8. The department was settling into its evening rhythm. The overnight nurses were filtering in. Callum had gone upstairs to write his statement. Ferris was still somewhere in the back, which meant he'd probably be there until midnight. She signed off her last chart, picked up her bag. She was almost at the exit when the overhead PA clicked. "Dara Whitfield to the third-floor administrative suite. Dara Whitfield to the third-floor administrative suite." She stopped. It was after hours for administration. The third floor ran a skeleton staff after 6. A PA call to the administrative suite at 8:20 meant someone had specifically arranged for that call to be made. She stood in the corridor for a moment, bag over her shoulder. Then she turned around and took the elevator up. The third floor was quiet in the way that hospitals get quiet after business hours. Lights dimmed, most offices dark, the ambient noise of the floors below you muffled and distant. She walked down the main corridor toward the administrative suite and found the door to Sylvia Marsh's office open and lit. Marsh was at her desk. She was not alone. There were 2 people Dara didn't recognize. A woman in her 50s in a dark jacket with no hospital affiliation badge, and a man slightly younger in a suit that had the specific cut of federal government work. They stood to the side of the desk, not sitting, not performing any particular authority, just present in the way that certain kinds of authority doesn't need to perform. Marsh looked up when Dara came in. "Thank you for coming up," Marsh said. She looked tired in a way that had moved beyond the professional and into the personal. "I'll let these 2 explain why they're here." The woman in the dark jacket said, "Nurse Whitfield, my name is Reyes. This is my colleague Anderton. We're with the Federal Inspector General's office. We've been briefed on your situation here, and separately, we've been in contact with Commander Rourke's unit regarding the documentation from this morning." Dara looked at her. "Okay," Dara said. "Dr. Holt was placed on administrative leave approximately 2 hours ago," Reyes said. "That process was internal to the hospital. What we're here about is a separate matter." She reached into a portfolio and placed a document on the corner of Marsh's desk, angled so Dara could see it. "During the federal compliance review that's been attached to Commander Rourke's unit action this morning, our office became aware that certain personnel records were accessed and modified in this hospital's HR system." Dara went still. "The warning placed in your file yesterday," Reyes continued, "was added via a credentials that shouldn't have had access to your file. We believe the access was unauthorized." A pause. "We're still confirming the specifics, but the reason I'm telling you this tonight is that tomorrow morning there will be a formal process that you'll be asked to participate in. We wanted to prepare you." Dara looked at the document. She looked at Reyes. "Who accessed the file?" she said. Reyes said nothing for a moment. "We're still confirming," she said again. But something in the pause, something in the way Anderton looked briefly at the floor, told Dara that they had already confirmed it. That the reason they were telling her tonight, the reason they had come here in person, after hours, to a nursing administrator's office, was not to prepare her. It was because what they had found was worse than a personnel file. "What else was accessed?" Dara said. The silence in the room changed texture. Reyes looked at her with the expression of someone deciding, in real time, how much of the truth a person can absorb standing up. "Your military service record," she said. "Someone accessed your classified service file through an unauthorized terminal. We believe the intent was to leak it." Dara's hands were very still at her sides. "To whom?" she said. Her voice was flat in a way that came from somewhere below the professional, somewhere she hadn't accessed in 11 months. Reyes set one more document on the desk. At the top, Dara saw a name, a media outlet, and a timestamp from 3 days ago. 3 days ago. Before Rourke arrived, before the lobby, before any of this became visible, someone had tried to expose her service record to the press, not to honor her, not because they thought the public deserved to know, but to use it as a weapon. To turn classified military background into dangerous, secretive, shouldn't be trusted with patience. To preempt whatever was coming by making her the story instead of Holt. She stood in Sylvia Marsh's office and felt something move through her that wasn't anger and wasn't fear, but was something older than both. She looked at Reyes. "The person who accessed the file," she said. "Was it someone in this building?" Reyes said, "Yes." "Is that person still in this building?" A beat. "No," Reyes said. "They left approximately—" She checked her watch. 90 minutes ago. Dara did the math without meaning to. 90 minutes ago was 6:50. 6:50 was 30 minutes after Holt had walked toward the stairwell and disappeared. She looked at Marsh. Marsh looked back at her with an expression that confirmed the calculation without speaking it. And the thing was, Dara had known. Not the specifics, not the file access, not the media contact, but she had known. In the way you know things when you've spent years reading the space between what people say and what they mean, that the complaint had never really been about professional boundaries. It had been about fear. Holt had been afraid of her from the beginning, not because she was dangerous, because she was the kind of person who didn't disappear when you tried to make her smaller, who kept showing up, steady and accurate, in the spaces where accuracy cost something. She picked up her bag. "What do I need to do tonight?" she said. "Nothing," Reyes said. "Go home. We'll contact you tomorrow at 8. Dara nodded. She looked at Marsh one more time. Marsh looked like she wanted to say something and had not found the words, and might not find them for some time. "Dr. Marsh," Dara said. Marsh looked up. "The compliance review on the 11 cases," Dara said. "The nurses who flagged those incidents. Some of them may not still be here." Marsh was quiet. "Make sure their records reflect what they did," Dara said. She walked out. The elevator was slow on the way down. She stood in it and breathed and let herself be still for 27 seconds, which was how long it took. Then the doors opened onto the ground floor, and she walked out through the main exit into the cold November air. She was 2 blocks from the hospital when her phone rang. Not a text, a call. Same local number. She answered. Silence for 1 second. Then a voice she didn't recognize. Low, slightly distorted, the specific quality of someone speaking quietly in a space they weren't supposed to be in. "They're not going to let it stay clean," the voice said. "Holt made contact with someone on the board, tonight, an hour ago. There's a meeting tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock, before your meeting with Reyes." Dara stopped walking. "Who is this?" she said. The line clicked off. She stood on the sidewalk with the phone in her hand and the cold air moving around her in 2 blocks of dark street between her and her apartment, the plant on her windowsill, the morning runs, the cold tea, and the quiet life she'd been building one careful day at a time. She looked at the phone. Then she looked up at the hospital, still lit against the night sky, and thought about Clara Mwangi in the ICU, and Marcus upstairs with his fractured radius, and Rosalind who'd made it to neurosurgery, and Vernon Okafor on the cardiac floor with his wife. She thought about what Rourke had said. "You're still her." She started walking, not toward her apartment, back toward the hospital. She didn't have a plan when she walked back through the main entrance. She had information, and she had time, maybe 12 hours of it, and she had learned a long time ago that 12 hours was either nothing or everything depending on what you did with the first 2. The overnight security guard, a heavy-set man named Bert, who had worked the 11 to 7 shift at Maplewood for 6 years, and who Dara had learned kept a thermos of very bad coffee and a paperback Western at his station, looked up when she came back through the doors. "Forget something?" he said. "Something like that." She took the stairs to the third floor because the elevator was slow and because she needed to think while her body was moving. The administrative suite was dark now. Marcia's office door closed, the lights off, Reyes and Anderton gone. She stood in the corridor for a moment, the board meeting that the anonymous caller had mentioned. 8 o'clock tomorrow, before her meeting with Reyes. That sequencing wasn't accidental. Whoever had set it up had known about the federal meeting and had deliberately positioned the board meeting to precede it, which meant the goal was to have a decision made, something on paper, before the federal process had a chance to operate. The only decision that mattered at this point was Dara's employment status. If the board moved to terminate her before 8 o'clock, or even to extend the administrative review in a way that created formal separation, it muddied everything that came after. It turned the federal inquiry into a wrongful termination question rather than a hospital accountability question. It gave Holt's allies on the board a procedural buffer. She needed to know who was in the room tomorrow. She went to the administrative records office, which was technically closed, and which she could access because 4 months of early shifts meant she knew that the overnight facilities manager, a quiet man named Osei, kept the master keycard for non-clinical spaces clipped to his left belt loop and was currently doing his 10 o'clock round of the basement. She found Osei in the basement corridor near the laundry facilities. "I need to get into the board records office for 10 minutes, she said. "The public meeting notices. I'm not touching anything confidential." Osei looked at her. He was 53, deliberate, not easily surprised. "Board records are public document," he said. "Yes. Meeting notices are posted 48 hours in advance. There's an emergency session tomorrow morning that went up today. I need the attendee list." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he unclipped the key card. 10 minutes, he said. The attendee list for the 8 o'clock emergency board session had 7 names on it. 3 she recognized as standing board members. 2 were listed as outside consultants, legal by the look of the firm name attached. 1 was the hospital's chief medical officer, a man named Dr. Philip Gare, who Dara had seen exactly twice in 4 months, and who had the quality of a person whose job was to be present at things without being the one to decide them. The 7th name was Dr. Marcus Holt. He had been placed on administrative leave. His name was on the board meeting attendee list. She photographed the document with her phone, replaced it exactly as she'd found it, walked out within 8 minutes. She texted Nguyen, "Holt is on the attendee list for an emergency board session at 8 a.m. tomorrow. He's on admin leave." "That shouldn't be possible." The response came in 4 minutes. "It's not. Board bylaws require active staff status for advisory attendance. I'll call Harlan Bell." Then 30 seconds later, "How do you know about this meeting?" Dara typed, "Anonymous tip." A longer pause. Then, "Okay, go home. Let me make the call." She stood in the corridor outside the board records office and considered her options, which was a habit she'd had since before she could name it. She could go home. Trust Nguyen to make the call. Trust Reyes to be at the hospital by 8. Trust the process she'd helped set in motion to complete itself without her standing in the middle of it. She was not good at trusting processes without standing in the middle of them. That was one of her known flaws. She'd been told so by people whose opinions she respected, in debrief after debrief, in 2 different theaters with no official names. She went home. She slept for 4 hours, which was more than she'd expected. The alarm went off at 5:15. She ran 3 miles in the cold dark, came back, showered, made coffee that she actually drank while it was still hot. She sat at the kitchen table and looked at the plant on the windowsill, which had developed a new leaf overnight in the specific, unhurried way that plants produce new growth. Without announcement, without any particular concern for whether you'd noticed. She got to the hospital at 6:45. The morning shift was filtering in. She wasn't scheduled until 7, but she came anyway, because coming early was what she did, and because she needed to see the department before whatever happened upstairs happened. Tanya arrived at 6:55 and stopped dead in the doorway when she saw Dara at the nurse's station. "I thought you might not come in today," Tanya said. "Why wouldn't I?" "Because," Tanya gestured vaguely upward, meaning the 3rd floor, the administrative suite, the 7 names on the attendee list. The patients down here don't know about what's happening up there, Dara said. So, Tanya stood there for a moment and then did what she usually did with things she couldn't argue with, which was move past them. At 7:40, Dr. Harlan Bell walked into the emergency department. Bell was 61, tall, with the deliberate pace of someone who had stopped rushing through hospitals in about 1998 and hadn't regretted it since. He was wearing his coat, which meant he'd come in early and hadn't been to his office yet. He found Dara between Bay 3 and Mosumri in the supply corridor. "I'm going upstairs," he said. "Thought you should know." "To the board meeting?" "Yes." "Holt's on the attendee list," she said. "He was," Bell said. "As of 6:30 this morning, he's not. I called the board chair at 11 last night and again at 6. The bylaws are clear." He looked at her with the specific tiredness of someone who has spent 22 years being the person who reads bylaws carefully. Whoever added him to that list was either counting on no one checking or counting on everyone being too uncomfortable to say something. "Which is it?" "Both, I think." He paused. "The outside legal consultants are still on the list. They represent the hospital's insurer. They're there because of the federal inquiry, not because of Holt." Dara processed this. The insurer's lawyers at an emergency board session meant the institution was trying to get ahead of liability, which meant the 11 cases in the compliance review had already been elevated to a level where the hospital's exposure was being actively calculated. "They're going to want a resolution," she said. "Yes. A clean one. That doesn't involve the word lawsuit." Bell looked at her steadily. "I expect that's the shape of the conversation, yes." "And Holt's position in that conversation." Bell was quiet for a moment. "He's not in the conversation anymore. He was counted on to be the firewall. Now he's the liability." He said it without satisfaction, just fact. She looked at him. "What do you need from me?" "Nothing this morning. Reyes arrives at 8. The board session will be concluded before she gets here." He held her gaze. "I just wanted you to know that there are people in that room who have read the full compliance report. All 18 months. All 11 cases." He paused. "You were not the only person Holt tried to remove. She'd known. She'd suspected. She hadn't known the specifics." "How many?" she said. 3 nurses and a pharmacist. Over 2 years." Bell's voice was flat in the way that meant he was doing the same thing she did, putting feeling in a compartment because the situation required clarity first. 2 of the nurses are no longer at this hospital. The pharmacist left 6 months ago. Holt cited performance concerns in each case. The compliance office found no documentation supporting those concerns. The weight of it landed without drama. 4 people. 4 quiet departures that had looked like routine turnover from the outside. 4 people who had caught something and then been systematically made smaller until they left. "The board meeting is about liability," she said, "but the real issue is that this is a pattern." "Yes," Bell said, "and patterns have consequences that single incidents don't." He left to go upstairs. She went back to Bay 3. "Yes." The board meeting lasted 1 hour and 14 minutes. She knew the duration because Nguyen texted her when it ended at 9:14 with 2 words, "It's done." Then a minute later, call from Reyes moved to 10. "She's in the building early. Marsh wants you upstairs at 9:30. Dara was in the middle of a wound assessment on an overnight patient, a man named Gilbert, who had come in at 3 a.m. with a laceration from a kitchen accident and who had been waiting patiently to be properly discharged while the world above him rearranged itself. She finished the assessment, wrote the discharge notes, walked Gilbert through aftercare instructions, and then handed the bay off to the oncoming nurse and took the elevator to 3. Sylvia Marsh's office had more people in it than it had the night before. Bell was there. Reyes and Anderton had arrived early. The 2 insurance lawyers were there, which gave the room a particular quality. The presence of lawyers before 9:30 in the morning meant something had already been decided, and they were there to make sure the deciding stayed decided. Dara sat in the chair across from Marsh's desk. Marsh looked better than she had last night, which meant she'd slept, which meant whatever had happened in that board meeting had resolved something. "The board has voted to initiate a formal termination process for Dr. Marcus Holt," Marsh said. "Effective immediately, his administrative leave is converted to suspension with pay pending the completion of that process. The federal investigation takes precedence, and the hospital is cooperating fully with Inspector Reyes' office." Dara said nothing. She waited. The formal warning in your personnel file has been permanently expunged, Marsh continued. The complaint filed by Dr. Holt has been found to be retaliatory in nature and will be so annotated in the hospital's formal records. You're being restored to full active status with no conditions. She paused. The board has also voted to issue a formal letter of recognition for your conduct during yesterday's trauma surge, which will be placed in your file. One of the insurance lawyers said carefully, the hospital would also like to discuss. I'm not looking for a settlement, Dara said. The lawyer stopped. I'm not filing a lawsuit. I came here to do this work. That's still what I want to do. She looked at Marsh. What I want is for this institution to look at those 4 people who left, the 3 nurses and the pharmacist, and do the right thing by their records, whatever that means professionally and legally. The lawyers looked at each other. Marsh said, That's already being discussed. Good, Dara said. Then I think we're done here. Reyes spoke for the first time. We're not quite done. There's still the matter of the unauthorized access to your service record. Yes. The terminal used for the access was in Dr. Holt's office, Reyes said. The access occurred at 11:47 p.m. 4 days ago. We have login credentials that are Holt's. We also have evidence that he made contact with a journalist, the one whose outlet was listed in the document you saw last night. She paused. That contact constitutes a potential federal offense, given the classification level of your service record. The room was quiet in a specific way, the quiet of people absorbing a severity that had just moved beyond what they'd expected. What happens now? Dara said. He'll be interviewed by our office today. His legal counsel has already been notified. Reyes looked at her with a directness that wasn't unkind. I want to be transparent with you about what a prosecution looks like in these cases. It's slow. It's not cinematic. It may result in charges, or it may result in a plea arrangement, or it may result in an agreement that involves cooperation with a broader inquiry. What I can tell you is that the access is documented, the contact with the journalist is documented, and the journalist in question has already confirmed receiving the outreach and declined to publish pending clarification of the legal status of the material. The journalist was responsible, Dara said. The journalist was cautious, Reyes said, which amounts to the same thing in this case. Dara looked at the wall behind Marsh's desk. There was a photograph there, the hospital's original building, 1962, a small brick structure that looked nothing like the place it had become. She'd noticed it in her first week. She didn't know why Marsh kept it there. Is there anything you need from me today? She said. A formal statement, when you're ready. It doesn't have to be today. I'll do it today, Dara said. This afternoon. She stood, looked at Marsh one last time. The overnight patient in Bay 3, Gilbert Rao. His discharge paperwork needs countersigning, she said. Can someone make sure that happens? Marsh blinked. Yes, of course. Dara walked out. The formal statement took 2 hours and happened in a small conference room on the second floor with Reyes, Anderton, a court reporter, and a digital recorder. Dara was precise and sequential and did not editorialize. She described the 4 months at Maplewood in the way she described everything, in terms of specific events, specific times, specific clinical decisions, specific responses. She did not describe her feelings. She described what happened. When it was done, Reyes said, "One more thing." Dara waited. "The journalist," Reyes said, "she's planning to run a story, not about your service record. She's been advised not to touch that, but about the complaint process at this hospital, the pattern, the 4 departures." She paused. She asked whether you'd be willing to speak to her. Dara thought about this for a moment. "No," she said, "but tell her the names of the nurses and the pharmacist if they've consented to that. Their story is what matters." Reyes made a note. But she was back on the floor by 2 o'clock. The department moved around her the way it always did. Organized chaos, the specific rhythm of too many needs and not enough hours, the overlay of human urgency on institutional routine. She picked up a new patient chart, Bay 5, a 70-year-old woman named Harriet who'd come in with dizziness and a fall, and who was sitting on the edge of the gurney with the expression of someone who was more embarrassed than in pain. They didn't need to make all this fuss, Harriet said when Dara came in. Let's see what we're dealing with first, Dara said. Then we can decide about fuss. Harriet had a small laceration at her hairline and a blood pressure that was lower than it should have been for her baseline. Dara went through the assessment systematically, asked about her medications. Harriet listed them, then stopped and said, with the specific hesitation of someone who has done something they know they shouldn't have, I might have taken the water pill twice today. I get confused with the pills in the morning. Which one? Dara said. The round white one. She clarified the medication, confirmed the furosemide double dose, adjusted the clinical picture accordingly. It was the kind of thing that was easy to miss if you didn't ask the right question, and the right question was never did you take your medication but always walk me through this morning. She ordered IV fluids, flagged the case for pharmacy reconciliation, and sat with Harriet for 3 minutes longer than strictly necessary because Harriet was alone and the embarrassment had started shifting towards something more frightened underneath. Do you have someone to call? Dara said. My daughter. She's at work. Call her, Dara said. Not because it's serious, because it'll make you feel better, and it'll make her feel better, and those are both good enough reasons. Harriet looked at her. You're very direct, Harriet said. I've been told, Dara said. Something that might have been a smile crossed Harriet's face. She reached for her phone. What? Moon found her at 4:15. Not to deliver news this time. Just found her. Came to Bay 5, where Dara was reviewing the afternoon's intake, and stood in the doorway without the urgency she'd had yesterday. Bell's putting together a new clinical protocols committee, Nguyen said, specifically around escalation pathways. When nursing staff flags something and it doesn't get acted on, he wants to formalize the process. She paused. He asked if you'd be on it. Dara kept her eyes on the chart. He asked you to ask me. He asked me to float it informally before he formally asked, because he didn't know how you'd receive it. I'd receive it the same way I'd receive it formally. Which is? Dara looked up. Tell him yes. Nguyen nodded. She didn't move immediately. She stayed in the doorway with something that wasn't quite finished. 3 weeks ago, Nguyen said, when the complaint first came down, I had the Bay 3 documentation in my notes from when it happened. I had it. She looked at her hands for a second. I kept thinking I'd find the right time, the right way to say it that didn't make me look like I was picking a side. You were picking a side, Dara said, not harshly. That's the thing about those situations. You're always picking a side. You're either picking the accurate account or you're picking the comfortable one. Nguyen absorbed this. I picked the comfortable one for 3 weeks. And then you didn't. And then I didn't. That still counts, Dara said. It was the honest thing and she meant it. And Nguyen seemed to know that because she exhaled in the way people do when something they've been holding tight gets set down. She left. Dara went back to the chart. At 6 o'clock, Tanya told her that a courier package had arrived at the nurse's station addressed to her. No sender listed. Local postmark, same-day delivery. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper. On it, in handwriting she didn't recognize. You should know. 3 of us tried before you. We just couldn't stay long enough. Thank you for staying. No signature. She stood at the nurse's station with the note in her hand. 3 of us. The nurses who'd left. 2 of the 3, at least, who had known what Dara was dealing with because they had dealt with it first. She folded the note carefully and put it in her pocket. She didn't tell Tanya what it said. Some things didn't need to be processed out loud. At 7:45, 15 minutes before the end of her shift, the overnight news cycle produced the thing she'd been half expecting since Reyes had mentioned the journalist. Callum was at the nurse's station with his phone turned toward her. This just went up, he said. Caldwell City Record. She read the headline. Maplewood General Physician placed on suspension amid federal inquiry. Pattern of retaliatory complaints spans 2 years. The story was careful. No classified information. No name on her service record, though it referenced a military background. The names of 2 of the departed nurses, with their consent clearly stated, and the pharmacist, who had agreed to be named. Quotes from Nguyen, attributed. A statement from the hospital that confirmed the federal cooperation and the suspension without elaboration. Holt was named, directly. His attorney had declined comment. Callum was watching her face. "You knew about this," he said. Not accusatory. Figuring it out. "I knew it was coming. Are you okay?" She looked at the screen for another second. A physician's name in a newspaper, attached to words like federal inquiry and retaliatory pattern, was not a small thing. It was the end of a version of a career that had operated for 9 years with the hospital's institutional protection wrapped around it like insulation. That insulation was gone now. What remained would be visible and cold and permanent. "Yes," she said. She handed the phone back and picked up the last chart of her shift. She was halfway through it when her phone buzzed. Not Nguyen, not Tanya, a number she'd had in her phone for 11 months without using. The direct line she'd been given at separation, in case of emergency, the kind of number you don't call unless the situation justifies it. She looked at the screen. The text read, "Rourke, call when you can, not urgent, but there's something you should know." She stared at the message. Not urgent from Rourke meant it wasn't operational. Something you should know meant it was personal. The combination, from a man who used exactly as many words as the situation required and never one more, meant it was something he'd been thinking about for a while and had decided she was ready to hear. She thought about the lobby yesterday morning. 8 men in a salute she hadn't asked for. "You're still her?" She put the phone in her pocket, finished the chart, signed off her shift, and stood in the corridor outside the nurses' station with the note from the departed nurses folded in her pocket and Rourke's message unanswered on her phone, and understood, with the specific clarity that comes when multiple things resolve at once, that the quiet life she'd been trying to build and the person she actually was had never been as separate as she'd been telling herself. She pulled out the phone and called. Rourke picked up on the second ring. "Whitfield," he said. "Rourke," a pause, the kind he used to organize what came next. "You need to know something about the Meridian Station operation," he said, "about what came after the arrests." She went very still. "What came after?" she said. "One of the cell members," Rourke said, "gave a debrief in exchange for cooperation. He gave us names, organizational connections." Another pause. "One of those connections has a prior record in Caldwell City, before the cell was active, before the operation." His voice was exactly level in the way it got when the information was serious. "The person was recently employed at Maplewood General." The corridor was empty. The department noise was behind her, muffled. "Give me the name," she said. Rourke said it. She had heard that name every day for 4 months. The name was David Orell, HR representative. The man who had sat across from her in the formal review with his notepad, and his careful neutrality, and his habit of writing things down even when there was nothing worth writing. The man who had been in Sylvia Marsh's office for every administrative meeting, who had processed her personnel file, who had access to every document, every complaint, every internal record generated about Dara Whitfield since her first day at Maplewood General. She stood in the empty corridor and let the name settle. "How certain," she said. "The debrief is corroborated," Rourke said. "Cell member identified him from a photograph independently. His financial records are under review. There are transfers that don't match his salary." A pause. "He wasn't operational, Dara. He wasn't running anything. He was peripheral, a watcher, a contact point. But the classification level of what he accessed in your file, he knew what he was looking for," she said. "Yes." She thought about the review meeting. Orell's pen moving across the notepad, his careful questions. The way he'd left just enough silence to seem thorough without ever pushing in a direction that helped her. She thought about the unauthorized file access, the service record pulled at 11:47 p.m. from Holt's office, and understood now that Holt hadn't been working alone in that specific moment. He'd been given a direction. He'd been told what existed in that file and how to find it and what it could be used for. 2 separate people with 2 separate motivations aimed at the same target. "Where is he now?" she said. "Your building," Rourke said. "He came in this morning. He doesn't know we have the debrief. The cooperation agreement was sealed as of 6 hours ago. Reyes's office is coordinating the arrest. Tonight. 2 hours. They wanted you to know before it happened, not after." She breathed in slowly. "Why are you telling me this instead of Reyes?" "Because Reyes will tell you the procedural version," Rourke said. "I'm telling you the real one. He was watching you, Dara, from before Holt's complaint. The complaint gave him a mechanism. It gave him access to your file under legitimate administrative cover. He used Holt without Holt knowing he was being used. She thought about that, about Holt, who had been arrogant and retaliatory and genuinely convinced of his own righteousness, and who had also been, without knowing it, a tool in something larger than his own wounded ego. That didn't make what Holt had done smaller. It just added a layer that hadn't been visible. "Rourke," she said. "Yeah?" "The plan in my apartment, the entry 10 days ago. That was us," he said, "checking for surveillance. We found a passive device in the hallway smoke detector. Outside your door, it was removed." She closed her eyes briefly. A passive device. Someone had been listening to her comings and goings for long enough that they'd needed a device to do it efficiently. "How long?" she said. "We think 6 weeks. Since around the time Holt filed the complaint. Since around the time the unauthorized file access occurred. The complaint had been the starting pistol for something that had been building longer than that." "Is there anything I need to do tonight?" she said. "Stay in the building. Don't approach Orel. Don't give him any indication that anything has changed." A pause. "Can you do that?" "Yes," she said. "Reyes will come to you directly when it's done." The line went quiet. She put the phone in her pocket and stood in the corridor for a count of 10. Then she pushed off the wall, straightened her scrubs, and walked back into the department. David Orel was at the nurse's station. She saw him the moment she came around the corner. He was there with a folder, some HR administrative follow-up on yesterday's events, something that gave him a reason to be present. And he was talking to Tanya with the measured pleasantness he always deployed, the careful friendliness of a man who had spent years making sure nobody looked at him too directly. He looked up when Dara entered the department. She met his gaze. She kept her face exactly as it always was. Neutral, present, slightly occupied with whatever came next. The face she'd had in debrief rooms and field positions and 12-hour trauma surges. The face that gave nothing away because there was nothing to give. Because she'd learned to keep the internal and external so separate that one didn't bleed into the other. She walked to the medication cabinet, checked the supply log she'd been meaning to check, and did not look at him again. He said across the station, "Long day, Nurse Whitfield." "They all are," she said without turning. She heard him close his folder, heard his footsteps move toward the exit corridor, heard the sound of someone who had no idea that the last ordinary hour of his life was already behind him. She kept her eyes on the supply log. The arrest happened at 9:47 p.m. She knew the time because Reyes sent a text, precise, factual, the way Reyes communicated, that said, "Orel in custody. Federal detention. You're clear. 2 words fewer than it's documented, but the same weight in different directions." She was sitting in the break room with a cup of coffee that had gone warm rather than cold, which was a small improvement on most nights. Tanya was across from her, not talking, just present in the way that Tanya was present when she knew something had happened and was waiting for Dara to decide how much of it to share. Dara put her phone down on the table. "It's over," she said. Tanya looked at her. "Which part?" "The part that was dangerous." She picked the coffee back up. "The rest of it? Holt, the board, the compliance review? That's process. That'll take as long as it takes. But the part that was actually dangerous is done." Tanya was quiet for a moment. "I don't understand all of what just happened." "I know." "Are you going to explain it?" Dara thought about this. About how much of it was explainable, and how much was sealed federal cooperation agreements and classified service records and a decade of work that had never appeared in any public document and never would. "Not tonight," she said. "Maybe not ever, some of it." Tanya accepted this. That was one of Tanya's qualities, and she could accept the shape of a thing without requiring all the details of it. It was a rare quality. "Are you okay?" Tanya said. Dara thought about it honestly, which she didn't always do when people asked. "I think so," she said. "I'll know better in a week." That was the truth. That was the actual truth, imprecise and unresolved and human, and she said it out loud because Tanya had earned the actual truth. The week that followed was not cinematic. It was paperwork and formal statements and a deposition for the federal case that took 4 hours and covered ground she had already covered in the statement with Reyes, and then covered again at a slightly different angle because that was what depositions did. It was a meeting with Bell's new clinical protocols committee, where she sat at a table with 3 nurses and 2 attending physicians and a pharmacist, and they spent 2 hours arguing productively about escalation pathways and documentation standards and what it actually meant to protect someone who flagged a safety concern from the informal retaliation that didn't show up in formal complaints. It was a phone call from one of the departed nurses, a woman named Siobhan, who had left Maplewood 14 months ago after Holt's complaint about her had resulted in a formal warning that had made her next job application significantly harder. Siobhan called on a Tuesday afternoon. She had a careful voice, the voice of someone who had rehearsed this conversation and then found that the rehearsal didn't quite fit the reality of making it. "I don't really know what to say," Siobhan said. "You don't have to say anything," Dara said. "I wanted to say thank you, but that feels, I don't know, insufficient." "It's not insufficient. It's exactly right." A pause. "My record is being corrected. The hospital's legal team called, the warning is being expunged, and they're issuing a formal letter of correction." Her voice did something complicated. 14 months. I spent 14 months thinking I'd done something wrong." Dara sat with that for a second. "You caught a medication error," Dara said. "That's what you did. And then a person with more institutional power than you made you pay for it. That's what happened. It wasn't about you being wrong." "I know that now." "You probably knew it then," Dara said. "You just couldn't afford to say so." Another silence. How do you stay?" Siobhan stopped. Tried again. "You went back the next day. After everything, you just went back." Dara thought about how to answer this in a way that was true rather than tidy. "I went back because the patients didn't stop needing things just because my situation got complicated," she said, "and because leaving would have meant that everything Holt did worked. And I was too angry to let that happen." She paused. It wasn't noble. It was partly stubbornness. Siobhan made a sound that might have been a laugh. "Well, okay. You would have done the same thing," Dara said. "You were just in a different position." She meant it. That was the thing people didn't understand about these situations. The ones who stayed weren't braver than the ones who left. They were differently positioned, different financial margins, different support structures, different levels of institutional vulnerability. Siobhan had a family. She'd had student debt. She'd had a mortgage and a child and the very specific calculation of a person who cannot afford to be the one who fights. Dara had left one life and built a small, inexpensive second one and had nothing to lose that she couldn't replace. That wasn't courage. That was math. Dr. Marcus Holt's formal termination was completed on a Thursday, 16 days after his initial suspension. The process had moved faster than these processes typically moved, which meant the compliance review findings had been serious enough to override the usual institutional inertia. His medical license was flagged for review by the state medical board, which was a separate process that would take longer and end less predictably. Medical boards were slow, and the outcomes depended on how well an attorney could frame 17 years of otherwise clean practice against 18 months of documented pattern. Dara read the termination notice because Nguyen forwarded it to her, and she noted the language: professional misconduct, retaliatory conduct, failure to maintain standards of patient safety. And then she set her phone down and finished her lunch. She had started eating lunch in the break room again. Not because the supply corridor wasn't still a convenient option, but because she'd decided the supply corridor was a habit formed from the impulse to make herself small, and she was done making herself small. Callum sat across from her most days now. He was getting better. At the work, at the judgment calls, at the specific skill of being confident without requiring everyone around him to be less confident. He still wrote things down in situations where the information didn't need to be written, but he was doing it less. "How's Marcus?" she asked him one afternoon. The 12-year-old from the highway crash. Callum had checked on him twice during his admission. Discharged yesterday. Mom seemed better than when they came in. She had a lot of questions. "She still does," Callum said. "She called the floor this morning. I talked to her for about 15 minutes. Dara looked at him. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "That was the right call." He looked mildly pleased and tried not to show it, which was the most 26-year-old thing she'd ever seen him do. The federal case against David Orell moved through its preliminary phases with the slowness that federal cases moved at, which was to say, systematically, with more paperwork than a civilian could reasonably imagine, toward an outcome that was not yet finalized but whose direction was visible. He had accepted a cooperation agreement. The cooperation had already produced 2 additional names in a network that Rourke's unit was now actively working. The details of that were not available to Dara, and she didn't ask for them. She had given her deposition and her formal statement, and she had answered every question she was asked, and that was the extent of what she could do. And she had made a specific decision to let the rest of it belong to the people whose job it was. What she knew, Aurel had been paid for information, small amounts irregularly, in a pattern designed to look like freelance consulting income. He had passed information about hospital personnel, not just Dara, she learned eventually, but others with federal affiliations or contractor backgrounds who had cycled through Maplewood over the years. He had used the access of his position the way infrastructure gets exploited, quietly, without drama, precisely because it didn't look like anything. She thought about him in that review meeting, his careful neutrality, the specific performance of being a person who had no investment in the outcome. She thought about the fact that she had looked at him and calculated nothing, had filed him in the category of institutional process and moved past him. That was a gap. She'd had a decade of training that should have caught it, and it hadn't, because she'd been building a quiet life, and quiet lives require you to stop looking for certain things. She wasn't sure whether that gap was a failure or just evidence that being a civilian actually meant something, that you couldn't maintain the operational alertness of a deployed environment indefinitely without it costing something essential, that the cost of truly stopping was occasionally getting it wrong. She thought about this for a while and arrived at no clean conclusion, which was probably the honest answer. Clara Mwangi came to find her on a Friday afternoon, 6 days after her discharge from the ICU. She walked into the emergency department with the careful gait of someone who was not fully back but was back enough, and she asked for Dara by name at the nurse's station, and Tanya came to find Dara in Bay 4 with the specific expression she used when something was happening that she thought Dara should handle personally. Clara was 57, smaller than Dara had registered in the chaos of Bay 1, with close-cropped gray hair and the posture of someone who had spent a career being competent at something. Her husband Garrett was with her, the same large man who had sat in the hallway with his face in his hands, who was now upright and composed and still clearly terrified underneath. "I wanted to see the place where it happened," Clara said. "The room." Dara walked her to Bay 1. The bay was empty between patients, clean, the equipment in the positions it was always in. It looked like every other emergency bay, functional, impersonal, fluorescent. Clara stood in the doorway and looked at it for a moment. "It doesn't look like much," she said. "They never do," Dara said. Garrett put a hand on his wife's shoulder. Clara covered it with her own hand without looking at him. The specific gesture of 2 people who had been together long enough that comfort was sometimes just the weight of a hand. "The doctor said I had maybe 20 more minutes," Clara said, "if the initial assessment had taken longer." Dara said nothing. That was the number. She'd known the number. "I'm a teacher," Clara said. "High school chemistry. I've been teaching for 29 years. She looked at Dara with the directness of someone who has decided to say the exact thing she means. "I have 11 students who are in their first year of college right now, 3 who are applying. Next year I have a kid who I think might actually do something extraordinary with the right attention." She paused. "I'm telling you this because I want you to know what those 20 minutes were worth." Dara looked at her. "I know what they were worth," she said. Clara nodded. "Good." She looked at the bay one more time. Then she looked back at Dara. "You don't look like someone who needs to hear that she did a good thing." "I don't need to hear it," Dara said, "but I'm glad you said it." Clara's mouth curved slightly. "So am I." They walked back to the main corridor. Garrett shook Dara's hand with both of his, which was more than he'd planned to do based on his expression, and Clara said she was going to let her students know she'd be back in January and she needed to update her lesson plans, and the class was behind on thermodynamics. And there was something in the brisk practicality of it, the immediate return to the work waiting, that Dara recognized. She watched them go. The thing about justice, Dara had learned, was that it rarely arrived the way you imagined it would. It didn't arrive as a moment. It arrived as a series of smaller corrections that accumulated into something you could eventually call resolution, And by the time the last piece was in place, you were usually already 3 crises past the thing you'd needed justice for, and you had to look back deliberately to see it clearly. Holt's license review concluded 4 weeks later with a formal censure and a 2-year supervised practice requirement. Not revocation, which disappointed people who wanted a cleaner ending, but a consequence with weight and duration and a public record that would follow him. His name would appear in the state medical board's published decisions. That was permanent. Orell pleaded guilty to federal charges of unauthorized access to classified records and conspiracy. The cooperation agreement reduced the sentencing range, but the guilty plea was public, the charges were specific, and the federal case documentation would be available in the public court record. He would not practice in any administrative capacity again. That was the more practical consequence, and it was the one that mattered in the specific way that practical consequences do. The 2 departed nurses both found new positions. Siobhan moved to a hospital 2 hours north and sent Dara a text on her first day. New place, clean record, thank you. The second nurse, a man named Terrence, who had left Maplewood 10 months ago and gone back to school for his NP, sent nothing and owed nothing. The pharmacist, whose name Dara learned was Kwame, gave an interview to the Caldwell City Record that was precise and measured and made very clear what the pattern of retaliation had cost him professionally. The interview ran on a Wednesday. By Thursday, 3 other hospital systems in the state had reached out to Kwame for contract positions. Institutional memory is short. Public record is not. That was a thing worth knowing. Bell's Clinical Protocols Committee produced a formal policy revision in 8 weeks. It was not a perfect document, no policy was, but it had specific language about nursing escalation rights, specific protections against informal retaliation, and a clear reporting pathway that didn't run through the HR office, which was a meaningful structural change. Dara had argued for the last provision in the second meeting, and Bell had backed it, and the 2 insurance lawyers who'd been observing the committee had looked at each other with the particular expression of people calculating whether to push back and deciding the math didn't favor it. The document went into effect on a Monday. Dara read the final version on her lunch break, made one note in the margin of her copy about a clarification that should be in the next revision, and went back to her patients. Work called again in December. She was off shift at home with the plant on the windowsill that now had 4 new leaves and was beginning to crowd the pot and would need repotting in the spring, which was something she was looking forward to in the specific quiet way she'd started looking forward to small things. "How's civilian life?" he said. "Getting better at it," she said. "The oral case is closed on our end. The 2 names he gave us, both prosecuted. The cell is done." "Good. The Meridian Station commendation is officially in your federal record," he said. "Unredacted version. In case you ever need it. For anything." "I have everything I need here," she said. A pause. "I know." She could hear in his voice that he'd expected this answer. Maybe that was why he'd called, not to offer her something, but to hear her say the thing that confirmed she'd actually gotten to where she'd been trying to get. "You're good, Whitfield." "I am," she said, and meant it. After the call, she sat at the kitchen table for a while, not doing anything. The apartment had accumulated small changes since the day she'd moved in. A second chair, a better lamp, a shelf she'd put up herself slightly crookedly, and decided to leave because the slight crookedness bothered her less than she'd expected. The morning runs had become 4 times a week instead of 3. She'd learned the name of the woman downstairs who kept the door propped open and had started saying hello, which was a small thing that had cost her something initially and now cost her nothing. She thought about the 10 years she'd spent in a world that required her to be precise and capable and invisible, and she thought about the 4 months she'd spent in this building with these patients being precise and capable and visible, whether she'd wanted to be or not. And she thought about the 12-year-old Marcus and his careful mother, and Clara Mwangi's 11 college students, and Vernon Okafor and his wife, and Harriet, who had taken her water pill twice and called her daughter, and Rosalind, who had come in with what she thought was just a migraine. She thought about Siobhan, spending 14 months thinking she'd done something wrong. Here is what Dara Whitfield understood, sitting at her kitchen table in December with the window dark and the plant on the sill and the slightly crooked shelf on the wall. The people who try to make you small are almost always afraid. Not of you specifically, of what you represent. The possibility that the structure they've built their authority on is not as solid as they need it to be. Holt had not filed that complaint because Dara was a bad nurse. He'd filed it because she was a good one, and good nurses in that specific way. The kind who see things, who act on what they see, who don't need his validation to know they're right, were a direct challenge to the story he needed to tell about himself. That was the thing about the quiet ones, the ones who don't argue back, who don't perform confidence, who simply show up and do the work at a level that makes the noise around them irrelevant. They're not invisible because they're small, they're quiet because they're focused. And focused people, over time, tend to outlast the noise. She wasn't special. That was important to say clearly. She was not special. She had skills from a life most people would never live, and those skills had served her in this building. But the fundamental thing, the willingness to show up for the person in front of you even when the institution is working against you, that wasn't hers alone. Siobhan had it. Kwame had it. Terrence had gone back to school and was getting an NP rather than quitting medicine, which was its own form of the same thing. Institutions don't change because heroes arrive. They change because enough people, in enough small moments, decide that the accurate account is worth more than the comfortable one. That was the work, not the dramatic version, the daily version. Mom. She went back on shift the next morning at 5:15. Early, as always. The night nurse, a quiet man named Pete, who she'd come to like for his habit of leaving the department in better shape than he'd found it, handed off with the particular relief of someone completing a long stretch. Bay 2 is a new admit, Pete said. Chest pain, 64, came in at 3. Stable, but the second troponin came back elevated. I see it, Dara said, already scanning the chart. Good night, Pete. Morning, Whitfield. She was in Bay 2 before the department had fully woken up. The patient, a man named Howard with the resigned expression of someone who had been arguing with his body for years and was now losing, looked up when she came in. They keep saying I should relax, he said. The chest pain tends to argue against that. He almost smiled. Fair point. She pulled the stool close and sat down, which she did when she had a few minutes, and the situation wasn't immediately critical. Sitting changed the dynamic, made the conversation slower and more honest. Tell me about this morning, she said, from the beginning. And he did, and she listened, and outside the bay the department was beginning its daily accumulation of needs and demands and urgent, ordinary things, and Dara Whitfield sat with her patient in the particular quality of attention that had always been her real gift. Not the tactical training, not the clinical knowledge, but the fundamental willingness to be completely present for the person in front of her, for as long as they needed, for the rest of her working life. The woman everyone had tried to erase had stayed, and in staying, she had changed the shape of the place around her permanently in ways that would continue after she was gone. In a policy document with better escalation language, in a resident who had learned to unfreeze, in the records of 4 colleagues whose exits were now correctly annotated, in the 11 cases that were now fully documented and would inform how this institution made decisions for years forward. She hadn't done any of it to be remembered. She'd done it because it was right, and because walking away from what's right has its own kind of cost, and she'd calculated that cost clearly and decided she couldn't afford to pay it. That, in the end, was the whole story. Not the salute in the lobby, not the federal commendation, not the front page of the Caldwell City Record, just a woman who showed up early, read the charts carefully, and refused to become smaller than she was.